Welcome to the PA Books podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. While the focus is always on Pennsylvania, topics like the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Gettysburg, the Industrial Revolution, the coal and steel industries, and authors like John Updike, David McCullough, and John Grogan have a universal appeal. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
This week on PA Books, David Finoli and Bill Ranier, the authors of the Pittsburgh Pirates Encyclopedia, 2nd edition.
Our guests are Bill Ranier and David Finoli, and they are the authors of this book, the Pittsburgh Pirates Encyclopedia. David, we'll start with you. When did you start following the Pirates?
I started following the Pirates probably late 60s, 68, 69. I was about 7, 8 years old at the time, and actually saw my first game at Shea Stadium the year the Mets won the World Series in 1969. Uncle took me to see the Pirates, and luckily one of the few games the Mets lost in that stretch in September, and fell in love with the team at that point.
Did you have any heroes right early on?
Oh, Roberto Clemente. I think he was every kid's hero in that era. Could do it all. Certainly, when asked to hit for power in the late '60s, he showed he could with 29 homers, and just. If you think about what Jackie Robinson went through, being from a Latin American player, he went through sometimes a lot more difficult time with the language barrier as well as the color barrier, breaking into the league, and just by the end of his career, revered. Certainly among the city, got to show himself off in the 1971 World Series to a nation that I'm sure at the time didn't fully appreciate what a superstar he was. And unfortunately, only a few days after the Steelers played in their first AFC Championship game, well, actually the same day, not a few days. It was a few days after the Immaculate Reception. He died a hero's death, trying to take supplies to Nicaragua and get them through a government that was stealing the supplies and not getting them to the people. Certainly today, he lives as the ultimate icon in Pittsburgh, sports or otherwise.
Bridge.
He has his bridge. He has actually a stat that came up when I was researching for another book. He has more things named after him worldwide than any U.S. president, and just remarkable. I mean, in Puerto Rico, he's considered probably the most beloved citizen of the country there is, and you know, here you just see him everywhere. Pirate fans, you know, it's almost like they still mourn the loss 40 years later, and it's something you just really don't see around, and just what a remarkable player, remarkable life he lived.
Bill, what's your early memories of the Pirates?
Well, my earliest memory was going to Forbes Field and seeing Clemente play. But what I remember most about the day was two fans ran onto the field, shook Clemente's hand, and then scaled the screen in right field. You know, I was probably about 7 or 8 years old at the time, so that kind of made an impression. You know, I didn't really understand that much about baseball, but you know, I knew Clemente was the best player on the team.
Did you follow the team in the paper and read box scores and listen to them on the radio?
Not at that age, but as I got older, I really fell in love with the team around 1971. And at that point, I became really obsessive about, you know, listening to as many games as I could, because there weren't that many games on TV in those days. There was like 40 games a year, maybe televised, and they were all away games. So I'd listen to the Bob Prince and Nellie King on the radio every night, catch the games on TV when I could, and of course read the morning edition of the paper and the afternoon edition of the paper to catch different takes on the game.
It's interesting you mentioned about listening to the game and how it's kind of a lost art now unless you're driving in the car. My father, who just a devout baseball and pirate fan, he's turning 100 this year. And he was a little upset that he couldn't get many games in spring training because he really wanted to watch baseball. And so I said, Dad, why don't you just listen to the game on the radio? So he turned it on, and he calls me at work and just goes on and on about, oh my gosh, it was like when I was younger, they're just so descriptive. And he started just remembering all the times he would sit down. My gosh, he was alive when they won the 25 series, and he was a fan then. And he just remembered all those days of sitting down and listening to it, and it just was such a great moment to hear him talk about that.
Now, this book is the second edition, and you were on this program when the first edition came out, which was 2002. What's new, and why did it need another edition?
It's new. They're winning. That's the biggest new thing. There have been some good players in the last 20 years before the last couple of winning seasons. Brian Giles, Jason Kendall, guys who modern fans will tell their children about. People who are 15 years old. Those are the players they grew up with and really, I'm sure, really loved. But we wanted to bring on a new kind of a new generation of Pirate fan and connect them with the tradition of Pirate baseball, as well as kind of honoring the current players, the current regime that's brought winning baseball back to Pittsburgh, and the players who were in the 20 years of kind of darkness.
Yeah. It's and every generation has it. When we were in high school growing up, the Penguins were the outcast, the team everybody stepped on, and nobody was really fans of. And when we went to high school and college, the Pirates were among the best teams in the game. And I know my children, my oldest son, who's just turned into a devout baseball fan, never really connected that, what a successful franchise this had been. And you had mentioned before the broadcast about the Phillies' all-time record. People were stunned to see that the Pirates had a plus 500 record for the history of the franchise, even after those 20 years. So it's kind of nice to, that they're finally enjoying what we did.
But you do compile their complete win-loss record over the history of the season up until the end of the 2014 season, and they have 9,999 losses as of the 2014 season.
Yes,
a lot of losses.
We've cleared that hurdle this year.
Well, are you guys stats fans? Do you pore over stats and just love crunching them in different ways?
For me, not as much as I used to. When I was single, didn't have children, I spent a lot of time looking at stats, reading stats of not just the Pirates, but pretty much every team in the league. I could probably tell you some guy who was a September recall for St. Louis in 1974. I can't do that these days. I like to say it's because I'm busy. It might just be early senility.
Well, you do have one statistic in here that's most Pythagorean wins over actual wins. Now, I have never heard that one. What's a Pythagorean win?
The Pythagorean theory is what a team is basically expected to win based off their runs scored versus runs given up. So it's just a simple calculation with. If you score more runs than you've given up, you should win more games than not. So say you score 800 and give up 800 runs, you should be 81 and 81. So if the team finishes 90 and 72, then that's plus 9 wins over what they could have expected with the runs they scored versus what they've given up. And conversely, if they lose or only win 72 games, that would be 9 games below. So it's a neat calculation. I don't know if it's over the course of time. I mean, it really does come out to a win plus in time. So it really does kind of calculate how a team should do. Over football's a little more difficult because it's only 16 games, but over the course of 162 games, you pretty much decided who the better teams are. At that point.
You were both wearing Pirates colors. When did black and gold become the Pirates colors?
In the 50s. Yeah, before that they wore red, white, and blue.
The 1950s?
Yeah, yeah.
I think as late as 48 they were black and white.
Yeah.
I want to say 50 or 51 is when they went to their more traditional script and colors.
Were they the first Pittsburgh team to use black and gold?
No, the Steelers.
Steelers were first.
So the first Steeler team, I believe, was like a more Notre Dame gold and black, and then they kind of morphed into it. So the Steelers were who originally were called the Pirates because Rooney loved the Pirates, and he was a baseball man. The Steelers were the first.
Now, you say in your book that the Pirates came to town in 1882, and they were called the Alleghenies. Mm-hmm. When did they become the Pirates? Where did that name come from?
They became the Pirates in the early 1890s, and an interesting story. It was with the Philadelphia team. They were fighting over a player. Contracts weren't necessarily as cut and dry as they are now. So they were fighting over a player called Lou Bierbauer, who they were going back and forth with who actually owned his right. The Phillies had owned him. Then there was a Players League, and then after the Players League, the teams or the players that played in the Players League were thought to be able to go back to the teams they played for before. It was a one-year thing. It was like the first player attempt at a players union, players to control the game, and when that failed, and it failed miserably in 1890, it was thought to go back to your original team. The Philadelphia franchise made a clerical error with this player. Pirates swooped in, got him, and eventually were awarded him. And the Phillies spouted out, "You pirated our player." So, which is why if you go to PNC Park now, you'll see a Bierbauer garden, because he is in essence the godfather of pirate baseball.
If you had gone to a game back in the early days in the 19th century, well, first of all, where would it have been, and what would the experience have been like?
Well, we've been here on the north side. The original park the Pirates played in was called Exposition Park. There's actually 3 editions of Exposition Park. Each of them tended to flood, so the experience would have maybe been wet. You would have had to wear your rubbers in the rain, like they used to say. For a brief period of time, the Pirates had moved further inland away from the rivers to Recreation Park, which is the corner of Galveston and is it West North?
Yeah, it's a warehouse district.
Yeah, it's
right
a
now.
warehouse district on the north side.
Yeah.
Again, there weren't all the amenities. Certainly, you didn't have all of the different choices of what to eat. You may have been able to buy, a thinly sliced piece of chipped ham on a sandwich or something. They didn't even have hot dogs, I don't think, till the early 1900s.
Yeah.
Did they have stands?
Yeah.
There were stands. They were wooden stadiums. Forbes Field, which was built in 1909, was one of the first concrete and steel stadiums. Yeah. I believe the first one in the National League.
Yeah, Philadelphia had the first overall.
Yeah, in Shive Park.
Yeah.
What were the rules like? Were the rules different than they are now?
Well, in the 1800s, up until 1893, a pitcher stood only 45 feet away from home plate. So that was, I think, the biggest rule. Was,
right?
I mean, there were some scoring differences on, statistics and things like that. It took 8 balls at one point for a player to walk. I think that was reduced in like 1900, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. And actually, Frank Killen, if I'm not mistaken, was the pitcher who I guess he was throwing too fast for the distance. He was Pirate. He's, I believe, in our top 100 in there. And he was the reason that they moved back.
Well, he's the Pittsburgh reason.
Yeah.
New Yorkers would say Amos Ruzzi, who was a really hard thrower, was the reason. I'm sure Philadelphia would have their player who was the reason, and Boston had their player. But Killen was certainly a really hard thrower that people would say, well, he's one of the reasons why. They wanted to get more offense into the game, just like modern baseball always seeks to add a little more excitement and offense.
Did they have a scoreboard?
I know they did in the 1900s. Not real sure about that period of time, but they did in the first decade of the 1900s.
Old pictures that I've seen of the older Exposition Park, I don't recall seeing a scoreboard in those. Of course, there's not a lot of pictures. A lot of the pictures of Exposition Park are from the exterior.
Did you find box scores or stats? Like, how was it reported and tallied back?
It was you had putouts, you had attempts, which were at bats, and you had hits. It wasn't as specific as it is now, which is kind of the fun of researching that era. To kind of go through, and the box scores were a little more elongated to try to tell you more story, but you often, for our purposes, had to read into the story more to find out exactly what happened to the game, whereas today, with some of the amenities you have on a baseballreference.com or some of the other Retro Sheet is the other one I was thinking of, which has box scores as early as 1920s. You can reasonably recap a game from back then with those, but to do it at that point in time, you really, the box scores were a guide, but they weren't as expressive as they are today.
What was sports writing like back then?
It actually was. People tend to think when they're talking about it now, it was more respectful, it was every bit as colorful, it was every bit as, at times bitter. I mean, they were more respectful of players' private lives, but it was kind of fun to read. It was, at times, much more colorful to read than it is today.
It would be like kind of comparing Shakespeare's style of writing to Stephen King, maybe. I mean, it just, the style was much more flowery.
Yeah.
One of the other things I was thinking about when I was reading some of the old clippings was, like Dave mentioned, people didn't air the dirty laundry. Right. There might have been like euphemisms such as not taking his craft seriously enough, meaning the guy liked to drink.
Yeah.
I want to read this one thing from the 1886, you write about Pud Galvin, who won 364 career games. He had an outstanding move to first, as was evidenced by a game September 23, 1886, when he walked the first three batters of the game only to pick off each man.
He was very
uncommon statistic.
Yeah, just very good with that. I mean, it was a different strategy, different game. Now his 364 wins is pitchers in that era a little jaded. There weren't the 4 and 5 man starting rotations. I mean, the earlier you get into the 1980s, you're talking basically 2 major rotations with people in the rotation, with a third guy who would come in. So it wasn't uncommon to see wins in the 40s.
How could they do that? How could they pitch like every other day?
Well, I'm going to gather it was more the speed. I mean, they say that certainly one of the differences now, and I've never pitched, so I don't know, but is that they don't strengthen the arm properly in the minors, and they don't get them used to pitching. I mean, when we were growing up watching the game, 300 innings was not a remarkable feat. Now 200 innings seems to be that level that you go to. But back then, I would assume just the speed of the ball. It was more. I mean, they scuffed it. They did a lot to the ball to make it unhittable. Mm-hmm.
Another thing too is the ball was a dead ball.
Right.
The ball
right.
didn't go as far. Stadiums were bigger.
Yeah.
So even in the 1950s, I remember reading once that Ty Cobb had responded to a young pitcher's request for some advice, and he said, throw hard, but save your really hard stuff for when you really need it.
Yeah.
Nowadays, pitchers pretty much come out and they're firing. I mean, rotations, and the Pirates earlier this week there was an article saying the Pirates right now are averaging the fastest pitching in the major leagues. Yeah. Teams look for that. Teams look for guys who can stay away from contact. Yeah. They don't want the home run to be given up.
Right.
Did the Pirates make money in the early days? Was it a profitable thing for some owner to be involved with?
The Pirates were certainly a profitable team, the best team in the league, certainly in the first decade of the of the 20th century, or one of them. The Cubs certainly and Giants certainly were successful too, but Pirates won 4 championships that decade, drew well. They made fun of Dreyfus for Barney Dreyfus, the president, for building such a huge stadium in Forbes Field, because they weren't used to putting that many people in, and he was able to draw the 25,000 people that they would never give people credit for. So it was. I mean, it's nowhere near what we see today. Night baseball kind of helps that along, but Pirates were very profitable and certainly very innovative with what they did that decade.
Well, I don't mean to stick too much to the very early days, but because there's so much to talk about. But I do have to read this. In 1900, postseason, Pittsburgh Chronicle-Telegraph Cup, the Pittsburgh Pirates versus the Brooklyn Superbas, which is a great name for a team. and the Pirates were in the first ever World Series.
Yes. Yeah, the Chronicle Cup, there were several versions of it. There was the Temple Cup. It was basically between the top 2 teams in the National League. Not really to decide anything other than it was a way to make money. So it was a rudimentary first World Series, and that was the first year the Pirates had in essence merged with Louisville of the National League when the National League contracted from, I believe, 12 to 8 teams. And Dreyfus was the owner of Louisville at the time and made a deal. He wanted to stay in the game, made a deal to purchase a part of the Pirates and became their president and eventually majority owner. And with him brought Honus Wagner, Tommy Leach. Well, he gave
Fred
up.
Clark,
Right.
Felipe.
Right. Gave up Jack Cheesebro only to get him back so they could give it the appearance of a trade.
Oh, that's what you refer to as the most lopsided trade in history.
Yes. And it was a young, what turned out to be modern baseball's first dynasty. They won the World Series in 1901 through 1903 after that, and that was the first year of the American League, which was having a stealing war with the National League over players. They agreed to play each other in a postseason series, and the Pirates were heavy favorites and took a 3-1 lead. With Felipe was certainly the king. He had won, if I'm not mistaken, he won all 3 games that series. Yeah. And injuries, they had a pitcher named Ed Doheny who went mentally berserk. He was a real good pitcher. He was having a nice season, and so their starting core, which was the best in the game, was thin. If I'm not mistaken, I believe Sam Lever was injured. Honus Wagner was battling injuries, and unfortunately, Boston came back and upset Pittsburgh to win the series, 5-3. And it was the first black mark, in essence, on Honus Wagner's career. He was told by the Sporting News that part of it was because he was yellow, a coward, and it was something he took with him and took personally until he had a chance in 1909 to get rid of that reputation against Ty Cobb in their first World Championship season in 1909.
Is Honus Wagner remembered today like he deserves
Wagner
to be?
Is still revered. But people who follow baseball in depth, they'll rate Wagner pretty consistently in the top 5 all-around players of all time. He was the dominant offensive player in the league for 15 years. He was an excellent fielder no matter what position he played. He eventually settled in at shortstop when the Pirates wanted him to play short. He really didn't want to play shortstop initially. He felt that he was maybe better suited for third base, but the Pirate manager, Fred Clark, had approached Tommy Leach, who was playing short, and said to Leach, why don't you talk to Wagner and see if Wagner would agree to switch positions with you? Point out to him, all the great things that Honus can do, the great throwing arm that he had, how much stronger it was than Leach's. And Wagner agreed to play short and has undoubtedly had the greatest career of a shortstop in baseball history.
Yeah, it was nice on one end as Derek Jeter was ending his career last year, it brought back the stories of Hannes Wagner, as comically people would try to compare Jeter, and some try to make the claim he was greater than Wagner, which he's not even close to, at least in my estimation.
You say as a Pirates fan.
Yeah, but it was nice to see, Hannes kind of brought on the forefront nationally at that point, because that was the one shortstop that they were trying to compare him to.
Now, you have a lot of sections in this book that are the best and worst, and the top 10 and top 100, and you mentioned Fred Clark, and you rate him as the best manager, and Danny Murtaugh second. Now, why Fred Clark when Danny Murtaugh has so storied history?
He won 4 National League pennants. He certainly won the first World Series, has the best record. Interestingly, was certainly a Hall of Fame left fielder as he was managing the team, but just the great success that he had in that first decade, leading the Pirates, as I said, was the first modern dynasty.
Was Danny Murtaugh the manager when you all started following him?
Yeah, Murtaugh took over in '57, I believe it was,
yes, and
had 4 tenures as the Pirate manager. His health was bad. He retired first in 1963, and came back to relieve Harry Walker for part of a season in '68, and came back in '70. Retired again because of health issues following the Pirates World Series win in '71, and then came back a final time in '73 when the team was struggling. Won 2 more division titles in '74 and '75, and retired after the '76 season. Fortunately, he suffered a massive stroke following his retirement within a month or so of retiring, and passed away.
It was ironic that from the time he started, no Pirate manager survived Danny Murtaugh until Chuck Tanner came, because every Pirate manager they hired who wasn't Danny Murtaugh was relieved of their job by Danny Murtaugh. But I mean, he was certainly a great manager. No ifs, ands, or buts. He won with different teams. He won at the highest level, and no doubt, and again, deserves in the Hall of Fame conversation.
One of the incidents you tell in the story is when the first time an all African-American team was fielded from all 9 positions, and Danny Murtaugh was the manager, and he didn't even notice, didn't even occur to him.
No.
Yeah. I think Murtaugh said something like, when it comes to baseball, I guess I'm just colorblind.
Yeah, and he was. And it was interesting to read the description of it, because in the original story of it, nothing's mentioned. And so it was a little bit, it took a little bit of time before people kind of picked up on it, but it was funny reading or doing the research. I believe it was Doc Ellis kind of looked over to some of the players on the bench and made the claim, oh my God, look who's out in the field. And so they didn't even realize it as the game started.
Well, speaking of which, Pittsburgh was the site of some of the great Negro League teams of all time, the Homestead Grays and the Crawfords. The Pirates play any games with those guys?
I don't recall seeing anything about any specific Pirates versus Grays games.
Yeah.
Now, there were
Major
all-star
League.
teams, Major League all-star
Yeah.
teams who would play against the Grays or against the Crawfords or against Negro League all-stars. I don't remember seeing anything that said the Pirates took on Homestead Grays.
I don't believe there was. I think it was that. Although there was an interesting story in the '30s. Again, not real sure the accuracy of it. You've heard several stories, but great, and his name escapes me now. A great writer for the Courier,
Wendell Smith.
Wendell Smith came to Pie Traynor, offering the services of, among others, Josh Gibson, Satchel Paige, Oscar Charleston. Which, if you think about it, I think we touch in the book there, had he signed it, and again, nobody was going to sign an African American at the time, but had he gone ahead and had the guts and made the signature or made the signings, they would have been the New York Yankees. I mean, we would have probably won at least 5 or 6 World Series in the next 10 years.
Well, we could skip around and just open it to a random page and have you two talk about it. But one that I noticed is you have a list of 15 pirates who served in World War I, and among them is Casey Stengel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Casey Stengel and Billy Southworth were two great managers that played for the Pirates during the 1910s. They didn't play much for them, but they certainly were around at that point in time. And there was a manager named Hugo Besdick who managed in the late 1910s. Who is his thing in history is he's the only manager in baseball history who ever managed in the NFL. He actually was. He managed for the Cleveland or coached the Cleveland Rams, but he was more known as a great college coach for Oregon and Penn State, and I believe he's in the College Football Hall of Fame because of that. But they hired him as a manager. He actually brought the team back to 500. They were having difficult times in that point, and the joke was you look at the managerial talent he had on his bench to kind of help him out. But yeah, they certainly had very short pirate careers.
How long does it take to put a book like this together?
This one not too long. This is the second edition. The first edition took about 10 months really to put together. The research from the time we got a contract to do the book to actually having everything turned in.
How did you decide what to put in and what not to put in?
Well, there have been other team encyclopedias, and when we were looking at the different team encyclopedias, we took ideas that we liked from certain books and ideas we weren't crazy about, we left out. What we wanted to do differently was to kind of do a ranking of the players. We thought that would create a lot of good discussion, a lot of good arguments in local taverns, and people still will bring that up to me and want to say, well, this guy was better. Dave, I think, had this one fan who kept emailing him constantly talking about how Paul Wainer was better than Clemente.
Yeah. It was interesting. And we were lucky. Our publisher, Sports Publishing Inc., was good enough that they would let us basically create what we wanted to create. Because it really isn't like any other book. They put out a few other encyclopedias, and it really wasn't on the format that the others had. And we were pretty much novices in the book world at that point in time. And we were so happy they gave us the creative license, so to speak, to put together the book as we saw fit.
How'd they pick you to do the book?
We picked them.
Yeah. You had the idea?
We approached them.
Yeah, it was basically a great timing situation. I had just finished a book on baseball in World War II, which was my first book, and this is a book we always wanted to do. I mean, we've known each other since the early 70s, and we for years this is what we talked about every day. So we found out who did a similar book to what we wanted to do. We contacted them, and at that point in time, they were looking to add encyclopedias. So it was a good timing situation.
So when you took the first edition and wanted to do an update of it, did you just leave everything in this, or did you go back and revisit some of the things that were in the first volume?
Well, we revisited, first of all, our top 100 players. So we looked at them a little differently. When we comprised our list of the top 100, Dave and I each came up with a subjective list, guys that we thought would be, how would we rank these players? And then we came up with some objective statistical type of analysis and put that together, and we combined the two. So if a guy scored, say, if it was the number 50th rated player between Dave and I, and he was number 20 in the statistical ranking, he would move up to number 32, 33, something like that.
Yeah.
Did that make a lot of interesting discussions?
Oh, yeah.
Yes. That was the fun part. I mean, it was the fun part. And then we would, by this point in time, I mean, people were familiar with the encyclopedia, and we would bounce some ideas off of some of the folks who cover the Pirates for various things like pirateprospects.com. This one guy, John Drecker, does a fabulous job reporting for their West Virginia team. threw out the name Dots Miller. So we kind of, he was second baseman in the with Hannes Wagner in the early part of the century. And when we looked at him, it was a little eye-opening that, well, maybe this guy isn't just somebody we had a biography on. Maybe he's somebody that actually belongs in the top 100. Or, Billy had looked at Ed Morris, who was how we really didn't take him as seriously. He ended up in close to the top 50 in the book. But it was probably the funnest part of the book, and one we certainly, between the two of us, probably take the most pride in, because you want to make sure you nail it as close as you can. So it was one we revisited quite a bit.
One guy who barely made the top 100, Clyde Barnhart, at number 100. Was it hard to pick the 100th, knowing that you had to leave off everybody else?
Not really. In our first edition, he was probably around number 94 or something. So he was already in that list.
Yeah.
When you get down to with the statistical analysis, you might be talking 1 or 2 points out of a potential. I think Hannes Wagner scores like 300 and some points.
Yeah.
And when you get down to these people in the 90 to 100 range, you're talking 1 or 2 points making a difference on how they're going to be ranked.
And if you look at it, there's probably another 20 or 30 guys after that who, in my eyes, are interchangeable. But certainly Barnhart is a great Pirate, and you think about the thousands of players who put on a Pirate uniform.
100 isn't bad.
Yeah, hundreds not too bad at all.
You mentioned Paul, the Wainers, and number 3 on your list is Paul Wainer. What is distinctive about him?
Paul Wainer was a terrific line drive hitter. He had such a feel for hitting a baseball that when I got to interview Bobby Bregan for the first edition, he would say how Wainer could pick a bat out and know it was his bat. He could blindfold him, and he knew the difference. Led the league in batting 4 times. Before Clemente, definitely the top right fielder in Pittsburgh history. And some people would argue maybe the top right fielder in National League history before maybe Hank Aaron.
Yeah. No, he and one of the things about him, he's probably, you had asked earlier about if people remember Hannes Wagner. Well, this is the guy that people don't remember, who was probably the most forgotten Pirate legend, including sometimes the team. They retired his number. It was 2007, if I'm not mistaken, when they retired his number. Certainly a guy, in my estimation, who should have a statue in the stadium.
His brother was pretty good too.
His brother was real good.
Lloyd Wainer
He's on your list, pretty high up there.
Yeah.
Lloyd was not as good of a hitter as Paul, and Lloyd didn't hit anywhere near with the power. Paul Wainer had a unique style of hitting where he could basically hit the ball down the left field line or pull it down the right field line. Therefore, he had a lot of doubles, a lot of triples. Lloyd Wainer is more of a slap hitter, maybe more comparable over the last 50 years to Matty Alou, a guy who used his speed a lot, could punch the ball through the infield, chop the ball over a third baseman's head, seldom hit a home run, and a lot of his doubles were probably more leg doubles because he was so fast. He was one of the fastest players of his time. Unfortunately, he played during an era when the stolen base almost became extinct, so he doesn't have any impressive stolen base totals that people would look at and say, wow, what a great leadoff man, what a fast ball player.
Absolutely.
Willie Stargell, number 4. we could go through this and
absolutely.
do this for the rest of the time we have.
Now, Stargell, they say that Forbes Field robbed him of being a 500 home run man in his career. But here's certainly a guy who, when he came to Three River Stadium, immediately showed just how dynamic it could be. If I'm not mistaken, 48 home runs in 71. But thing about Stargell that at least as great as he was that last year, here was a guy that had been injured for a couple years before that. Picks it up a little in 78, but by 79 he becomes, has, in my estimation, and I know Billy and I discuss this at times, but in my estimation, that put him in the Hall of Fame.
I disagree. But
yeah.
Respectfully. Since we're on TV. Since we're on TV.
But in my estimation, he was a borderline Hall of Fame candidate before that year. But I mean, he picks up a team that your Phillies were certainly the dominant team in the National League at the time, and just has a magic year. It was our first year at Duquesne. We both were in high school together, Greensburg Central, and went to Duquesne after that, and the Pirates certainly cost me a bad semester that first year because I was at the stadium so many times. But Stargell just, I mean, winning, tying with Keith Hernandez for the National League MVP. In the playoffs, he just carries them on the back. The Cincinnati Reds were there, were the monkey on their back, so to speak. They had defeated them in 1970 and just a nasty NLCS, the Bob Moose wild pitch in 1972, and they defeated him again in 75. So they had no playoff success against the Reds, and certainly on with the help of Stargell, they sweep them in two dramatic games in Cincinnati, and then just blow them out in Three Rivers for Game 3, and then he just has a magnificent World Series against the Orioles. They come back down 3-1, and that seventh game hits the clutch homer, wins the MVP of the National League Championship Series, wins the MVP of the World Series, and we're down in Market Square celebrating the championship, and I remember thinking, oh my God, we're going to be doing this next year, going to be doing this the next year, and we've gotten a lot older, a lot bolder, and we're still waiting for that next year to happen. But I mean, he just is such a magnificent season in Pirate history for Stargell.
Bill, what part about that do you disagree with?
I think Stargell was a Hall of Famer before 1979. I think that when Stargell was playing 400 home runs, would have gotten a guy into the Hall of Fame, and he had already surpassed that. He had led the league a couple of times in home runs. He had multiple appearances in all-star games. I think that even if he had had a more steady decline without, another fine year in 78 and 79, I think that he still would have made the Hall of Fame. Maybe not on the first ballot, but I think he would have gotten in.
I just wasn't as convinced at that point. But he certainly, I mean, we both certainly agree he was one of the greatest Pirates of all time. And
you also have loads of players to talk about. Archie Vaughan, Ralph Kiner, Pie Traynor.
Archie Vaughan is, I mean, he holds the all-time modern Pirate record for batting average in a season with 385, but was one of the great shortstops of his era. Ironically, wore 21 at the end of his career, like Clemente, and drowned in his 40s. So he, two of the greatest players in Pirate history, both wearing 21, both certainly dying tragically at a young age.
And Vaughan dying a hero's death as well. He was trying to save a friend who couldn't swim. They were out fishing and the boat capsized. And Vaughan, I guess, was a pretty good swimmer. And I think when Vaughan was inducted to the Hall of Fame in 1985, his daughter did the acceptance speech, and I think she said at the time that literally they could have stood up in the water.
Yeah,
but the man he was with had panicked so badly that it pulled Vaughan down with him.
Yeah.
Ralph Kiner, I mentioned, who led the league in home runs for how many years?
7 years. Seven straight years as a Pirate, and was very gracious. I got to interview Kiner for the original edition of the book, and very gracious talking with him about his memories as a Pirate.
Who's the top pitcher on your list?
A guy named Babe Adams. Came over. He had pitched for St. Louis, I believe, in 1907. Was in the minors in 08, and was the first.
1908.
Yeah. and he was dubbed the first true Babe in baseball before Ruth because he had movie star looks. But he came to the Pirates in 1909. Was like a fifth starter reliever, so to speak. But in the 1909 World Series, had one of the great pitching performances in the history of the game. Won 3 games for the Pirates, including an 8-0 shutout in Game 7 against the Tigers that as well as Wagner played, he was the MVP of that series by far. Now, he was one of the great control pitchers of all time. In fact, one game, I forget the exact year, but he went 21 innings pitching without allowing a walk, which is still, it's a record that will never be beaten, obviously. But
he pitched all 21 innings?
Yeah, yeah. And his opponent, who I believe was Rube Marquardt, pitched all 21 innings too. He lost the game, unfortunately, but still one of the most dramatic, impressive control feats of all time.
While we're speaking about that, as we're jumping around, Harvey Haddix has the unfortunate distinction of, you want to talk about Harvey Haddix and his game?
Haddix was a left-handed pitcher, known as a very good pitcher with the Phillies, the Cardinals. He came to the Pirates via the Reds in 1958, following that season. And in 1959, on a cold day in May, he was fighting a cold himself, went out and pitched maybe the greatest game of all time, 12 and 2/3 hitless innings of pitching. And in the 13th inning, and the thing, I remember Bob Prince used to always say, there was no ball hit in that game that looked like it was truly going to be a hit. There was one nice running catch by the center fielder, Roman Mejias, but nothing that required a great diving play or an incredible throw from deep in the hole at short. Unfortunately, the Pirates hadn't scored either, so against Lou Burdette, a fine pitcher from the Braves. And in the 13th inning, the Braves, Felix Mantilla led off with a ground ball to the Pirate third baseman, Don Hoke, who made an error. Mantilla went to second. They intentionally walked Hank Aaron, which was kind of a no-brainer, but the Braves had an excellent hitter, Joe Adcock, following Aaron, who smacked what should have been a home run. Adcock passed Aaron on the bases, however, and it was ruled just a double, but it was a loss, the greatest loss maybe of all time, greatest pitch loss.
And ironically today, not even recognized by Major League Baseball as an official no-hitter. Before they would recognize anything over 9 innings. I believe in 92 or 93, you had to complete the game as a no-hitter to be recognized. But it certainly, arguably in my head is the greatest pitch game ever because nobody's ever pitched 12 perfect innings before. That would have been a game if you were watching. You just had to be crushed for the guy.
Mm-hmm. You have at number 13 Bill Mazeroski, who was not all that great a hitter. Good, but not.
He actually, when we were doing the stats for the first go-around, Bill had come up. He actually led the National League in several hitting categories for second baseman in the 60s. 60s were not a great hitting era. He did remarkably well when compared to his counterparts during that decade, which was something that certainly surprised me as we were looking it up. So he was a little better than he got credit for, but certainly, arguably, if not definitely, the greatest defensive second baseman in the history of the game.
Here's one who was not in your first volume, and that is Andrew McCutchen, who comes in at number 17. Now, we're recording this early in the season in 2015, and Andrew McCutchen is in the flower of his career right now. Is it hard to place him in the top 100 at this point in his career?
No, it wasn't hard at all. The question was, would he be in the top 20, and where would he fall? And in our rankings, one of the things we look at is awards that players received. And McCutchen's won an MVP award. He's finished in the top three straight years. He's been a dominant player, and much like an earlier Pirate, Kai Kyler, he hasn't had a very long career yet in Pittsburgh, but his career is dominated. Same thing in a way with Barry Bonds. Bonds was only here in Pittsburgh for 7 years, but he was, the best player in baseball for 3 of those years.
Right, and it's Bonds had, in my estimation, better 3-year period between 90 and 92, but certainly McCutchen over the last 3 years, top 3 guy in the MVP race, 2 of them winning the MVP in between. And I mean, the thing about him is he's a guy I can see spending the rest of his career here, and at the pace he's going, certainly should be a no-brainer for a top 7 or 8 in our list by the time he's done.
Well, before we run out of time, we should talk about the 1960 World Series, because you list the best 10 games ever, and you have the 7th game of the 1960 World Series as number 1.
Yeah.
Can you paint the picture of that game?
Well, you had a Yankee team who was just such a heavy favorite. I mean, you Berra, you Mantle, you Maris, certainly just a who's who of baseball history on that team. Against a Pirate upstart team who basically between 1949 and 1957 had been a doormat in the league. They surprised everybody with the second place finish in 58, 59. They finished over 500, but injuries kind of cost them advancement in the standings a little bit. But 60, they come out, they have the perfect season, they won 34, 35 games on their last at bat. Vern Law has season for the ages, wins the Cy Young. 3 Pirates finish in the top 8 in the MVP race, and Dick Grote, who was injured the last month of the year, yet led the league in batting and won the MVP. Hoke had finished second, and Clemente, who was a bitter moment in his life, finished 8th, and certainly it was something he felt was because of his race and heritage that was why he finished so low, which to the point he never wore his 1960 World Championship ring, instead wearing a 61 All-Star ring through the decade because of that. But regardless, you had great. You had up-and-coming young starters, a young Bill Mazeroski, Dickie Schofield, who replaced Grote in September at short and was magnificent. Bob Skinner, the Quail, Billy Verdon, certainly until Van Slyke came, was certainly the best defensive center fielder and in the team. And these guys just lit up the city. Won the pennant by 7 games over the Brewers, and just came into the series. The first series in 35 years is decided underdogs. Well, every game the Pirates won, they're nip and tucking, winning by 1, low-scoring games, and when the Yankees are winning, I want to say 33 to 2 outscored, or
55 to 27
for the series. Yeah.
Series.
Yeah.
And you have the Pirates team ERA was 7.11.
Absolutely.
And they won the World Series.
Right. I mean, the Yankees won 10-0. I want to say 16 to 2 or 3 one game, 13 to 0 one game.
Is it 12-0?
Or 12-0. Yes.
12-0.
Yeah. And the last game was going the Pirates' way. They were up 4-0. Vern Law, when I interviewed him for the original book, made the statement that Mazeroski should thank him for going into the Hall of Fame, because had Murtaugh left him in the game, there would have been no need for Mazeroski's heroics at the end of the game, because he had been injured in the celebration after they won the pennant. He tweaked his ankle a little, and I'm not sure Murtaugh trusted. He was starting to, by thank God, Bing Crosby, who had the film of the Game 7, which MLB put out a couple years ago, allowing us all to just live the greatest game in Pirate history.
Oh, the whole game is preserved?
Oh, yeah. It came out a few years ago. Bing Crosby was nervous about seeing the game. It was one of the owners of the team. And he was in France at the time, and he had NBC work him up a kinescope at the time that he could watch when he came back. And they were doing a documentary on Bing a few years ago. And they came across these cans of film, and they started playing them, and it's like, oh my God, this is Game 7 of the 1960 World Series. And so MLB Network put it on a couple years ago, and it was one of my greatest thrills to see that game. But he was starting to fade a little bit, so I tend to give Murtaugh a pass that was probably the right thing at the time to put him in. But the Yankees come back, they go ahead 7-4. Pirates in the bottom of the 8th. There's a play where Tony Kubek gets hit in the throat on an easy grounder. Clemente, with 2 outs, hits the ball to the first baseman. Pitcher's slow to get to first base, so he's on. So again, plays that could have gotten him out of the inning easily. So Hal Smith, who was potentially the greatest hero in Pittsburgh history, a platoon catcher, hits a dramatic home run to make it 9-7. Going to the top of the inning. Yankees chip away with 2 more runs to tie it up. One on a great play by Mickey Mantle. There was a line drive, I believe, by Yogi Berra that Rocky Nelson caught, and instead of tagging Mantle, he kind of...
It was a hard smash,
right.
Actually. Back, like a hard shot.
Hard shot.
And he
right. And
didn't throw to second.
Right.
Yeah.
And Mantle snuck in. And just fluke plays that kept this game close. And then Mazeroski, of course, coming up in the bottom of the ninth, taking Hal Smith's hero-ship away from him, making it the most forgotten home run in Pittsburgh history. And the place, my mother-in-law and father, I just love the stories of them talking about that game. Just erupted, and the city erupted, and still, I would say, in my estimation, the most memorable Pittsburgh team, regardless of sport.
And yet, you write in your book that Bobby Richardson of the Yankees was the MVP in that series, even though they lost.
Richardson set all types of RBI and hitting records. My argument would be not just Mazeroski hitting a big home run to win the series, but he also won one of the other games. His home run was the deciding blow in one of the other games, and he also had another really clutch hit in one of the games the Pirates won. So it seemed like, it's nice to drive in all those runs, but the Yankees probably would have won 5-0 anyways if Richardson hadn't gotten those hits.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we only have a couple minutes left. Bill, what was the greatest game you ever saw in person?
I was there when Clemente got his 3,000th hit. That still stands out to me. A friend of mine, John Toth, had gotten tickets. His father had gotten tickets through work, and a couple weeks ahead of time, we kind of joked, well, maybe we'll get to see Clemente's 3,000th hit. And the night before, Clemente hit it was at 2,999, and he hit a ground ball towards the Mets second baseman, Ken Boswell. And at first, the reaction in the stadium was, 3,000th hit. It's a hard chopper. Boswell fumbled it, but the official scorer posted it as an error. And John and I jumped up in my living room like, we're going to get to see that 3,000th hit tomorrow.
And Clemente was mad.
Clemente was mad. Yeah, he felt initially that that he had made a comment that scorekeepers had taken away many hits in his career. But then he saw, I believe it was Luke Quay, who worked for the McKeesport. Was it Daily News?
He was the one that night.
And he knew Luke Quay was a fair scorer and a good writer. And he said if Luke Quay said it was an error, it's an error.
Yeah.
And what was the hit that he got?
Clemente smacked a double to left center field the next day against John Matlack, was pitching for the Mets. And I remember when he hit it, thinking to myself in kind of a weird way, boy, if that's not a hit, he's never going to get a hit that 3,000th, because it was such an obviously hit towards the gap.
And David, what's your greatest moment that you witnessed?
The greatest game I saw was with Bill. It was the '94 All-Star game, which was exciting. But the greatest Pirate game, and again, I was also with Bill, was right over at PNC Park a couple years ago against the Cincinnati Reds in the wild card. And just after 20 years of what we went through, to see that place just so packed, I'm getting a little goosebumpy now talking about it. The fans it was like a college football crowd in the SEC. They were just so into it. Everything happened so perfectly. And in fact, that night I told Bill in 2001 when we went to the first game at PNC Park, if they ever make the playoffs, I'm going to eat sushi right here. I'd never had sushi before, and I have a clip of it on my old phone. But that night, he remembered. So I had sushi. It was the most disgusting thing I've ever eaten, but I kept my deal, and we ate it. But that was just such a fun, magical night, and as many good games as I've seen over the years, that is probably the one I probably cherish the most.
Well, that'll have to be the last word. We're out of time. We've been speaking with Bill Ranier and David Finoli. They are the authors of this book, the Pittsburgh Pirates Encyclopedia. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. We'd like to hear from you. Our email address is pabooks@pcntv.com. Like us on Facebook to learn more about PA Books.